Thank you both so much for that presentation. There's a whole lot of different areas covered in there, and I can tell from the questions that we've already had pouring in that there really is a lot of interest and questions to continue going forward. So I'll move to the Q&A. The first question that I'm going to pose to our speakers is about short-term labor opportunities during a crisis and how sustainable they are. So we had quite a few questions come in the beginning about the sustainability of livelihoods activities, particularly of short-term employment such as cash for work programs, what the potential impact of this type of program is for recovery of urban labor markets after an emergency, and whether these kind of short-term cash payments create expectations of people to be paid for tasks that otherwise would be done long-term without payment. So quite a few questions all mixed up into one there, and I'll pass that over to our speakers to hear their thoughts now.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting set of questions related to sustainability, and we also received quite other interesting questions, so let's go one by one. In terms of short-term employment, normally it is important in a post-emergency situation, because in an emergency lots of people lose their jobs and it is very difficult to find long-term solutions immediately. So the short-term employment like cash for work, for instance, is one of these remedial situations in which you can very quickly provide cash for people. It normally is to clean the debris and to work on waste management, etc., and gradually go into other areas of reconstruction. And this will bring immediate income or food in the case of food for work. But in the case of income for the families, it will also have multiplier effects in the local economy. And from there you can move from a situation of total crisis to improvements and so on and so forth until getting the situation as it was before the crisis, or sometimes even better, because many of these countries, like for instance Haiti, it was already in a very difficult situation, Port-au-Prince, before the earthquake. So as much as possible, we try to, well, now that we have to address the crisis, so let's also take the opportunity and provide training for people that they did not even have before, and strengthen organizations, etc. So that is the issue is how to combine short-term and long-term employment and facilitate the transition. You cannot have short-term employment forever, but you have normally, or after many disasters, you have to start with this, and gradually you move. Andres, when he started to make his part of the presentation, he presented a slide which shows the different stages of recovery going into development and how they somehow overlap. But I think it was a quite comprehensive picture on how you move from the first steps into sustainability. Do short-term cash payments create expectations? This can happen. Some people, of course, get used to receiving money for certain activities. As I said, it's in many circumstances difficult to avoid short-term employment in a post-crisis, immediately after crisis situation. But the solution is to clearly inform people that this is a short-term situation, and to prepare exit routes like skills training, recovery of enterprises and businesses, because they will generate longer-term employment.
We have a follow-on question that's related here that I'm going to add in about cash for work as well. And the question deals with some of the risks or challenges that can be associated with cash for work. The person asking is wondering, is cash for work of value in urban areas given the risks of corruption or even the risk of not having meaningful things to do, as has been the case in some of the contexts that you've talked about, such as Haiti or the Philippines. I wonder if you could address that sub-question in this area.
The first one, corruption can happen. It's difficult to say exactly when it happened or not. There are different ways that one can try to minimize the risk as much as possible. What I can say is that the aid community is very aware of this problem, therefore tries to avoid it as much as possible. In terms of work not being meaningful, of course we start with meaningful work. And in a post-crisis situation, you have a huge amount of necessary work, like starting with cleaning, especially in an urban area in which you have many buildings and infrastructure destroyed. You have to clean up many of these areas. You have to set up camps. You have to adapt buildings to receive people who lost their houses. So many crises also, they come together, unfortunately, with diseases, with epidemics, so you have a lot of work to be done in terms of hygiene, in terms of first aid in health. So there is a lot of very necessary work. At the same time, well, I know that this is debatable, but if you help people to have some sort of cash, and in terms of not so necessary work, if you help people and if you help them to get back into the labor market, this will have, let's say, multiplier effects in the local economy and the social benefits. And perhaps one way to avoid unnecessary work is to adopt labor-intensive techniques through which a larger number of people will share the same type of necessary work.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's a really useful spin on that question. We have one other question about cash for work that's just come in, and I'll just address that before we move to the next area. And that question is, what do you think of the idea of introducing cash for work programs in refugee camps? I'm not sure if ILO works in any camps currently or in the past, but someone in the audience is wondering what you think about using cash for work in refugee camps.
To our knowledge, the work of the ILO has been limited in refugee camps, mainly because it's the mandate is stronger of the UNHCR, and they have their stronger mandate. But it could be useful to use these programs to extend livelihoods definitely in refugee camps.
We'll move now to another area, and this has to do with constraints to labor. And the question that came in during the registration period was this one: how can humanitarians address or overcome the legal constraints to labor opportunities which are faced by some refugees in urban areas?
That is a really pertinent question. It's a really good question, because the refugees and IDPs face many decent work deficits that are common to their situation, and it points out there, and also in the report we previously mentioned, the lack of access to employment is restricted by their condition of by legal barriers because of their condition of being refugees. And it's, of course, we have to recall that the 1951 Convention of Refugees allows, gives the right to work to this, but this doesn't translate into the reality. The actual report states that 45% of the countries they're reviewed, I think they were 15 countries, don't allow refugees to work, and so those difficulties are also shared sometimes in cases of IDPs in Colombia. For example, if you accept that status, that internally IDPs, you can't work, and you have to add there the problems of discrimination, which also affect groups you wouldn't imagine. I was talking the other day to a colleague about the situation of displaced IDPs, internal displaced men in Ukraine, and how they were frowned upon. They were looked badly by the local community because they weren't fighting in the conflict areas. But also skills, you would imagine there's a lot of problems of skills recognition as people leave their houses with emergencies and leaving behind their documentation showing their capabilities. And they are also taking behind all these legal barriers and de facto there are cultural and language barriers, which push indeed refugees and IDPs to informal work. But these are access to employment is, as we say, not the only decent work deficits. The access to new jobs in urban areas requires the acquisition of urban skills, which and the lack of training or has some problems in terms of occupational safety and health. And also adding to all these problems is the problem of freedom of association and different rights that are restricted for refugees in urban settings.
Andreas, in your answer there, you mentioned discrimination in the case of the men in the Ukraine. And I wonder if you could touch briefly on another type of constraint to work or constraint to effective livelihoods, and that is social tension. And I think there's increasing awareness about areas such as Lebanon and Jordan where such high populations of the refugee population, and the tensions that this is creating. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about, what works or what can be effective in terms of addressing these issues about social tensions when it comes to working with refugees as well as host communities in terms of labor and livelihoods.
To address social tensions, well, the ILO works a lot, tries to work a lot with communities, so community-based planning and the assessing the livelihoods problems with the community helps assessing these problems. Also, the inclusion in these programs of both refugee and host community. So, in terms of not only employment but on skills, there is this rule of the 70 or 75% as opposed to 25% participation rates. Otherwise, of course there has to be different mechanisms that can avoid social tension. And would you like to add?
No, so also needs multi-agency collaboration because it's a cross-cutting issue that also needs UNHCR inputs, OCHA.
One of our attendees has also mentioned other kinds of constraints such as ability. And I think this kind of feeds into our next question, which considers another type of constraint to labor, and that is things such as gender and protection concerns. And so this question really centers around how these issues, gender and protection issues, impact work opportunities for refugees in urban areas, and whether there's any specific measures that you would recommend to increase empowerment when it comes to urban labor as a related question.
I will concentrate on the issue of gender, and then later I'll mention the other one. I imagine that the question about gender has the same meaning that what I understand about gender in development. So it's gender in humanitarian response. In the overall policy is generally to provide equal access to women and men refugees in urban areas, to whatever are the job opportunities without discrimination. And of course this also entails access to educations and skills learning. And many times also one needs to have some sensitivity in terms of the occupations, the professional occupations in the urban economy. Many humanitarian development agencies, they choose the specific sectors of the economy or occupations to develop, and through this they can target more women, because sometimes in a given circumstance, in a given locality, you have a bit of a division of labor between men and women. This is cultural. Men choose a few types of sectors of the economy, women choose others. And when this happened in a very short term, what you can do to provide discrimination and to provide, to avoid discrimination and to provide opportunities for women, is to, of course, develop the sectors of the economy in which women are more prone to work. And in the longer term, of course, there are different measures, such as government policies and awareness-raising campaigns, etc. And apart from, in terms of specific recommended empowerment measures, apart from, of course, good government policies, a measure that I know in regard to gender is for women to get together and form associations. In this case, refugee women, they can get together, and they may also want to try to build solidarity with existing women's movements in the whole city. If they exist in the whole city, this could be a way for women refugees to get a better foot in the labor market. In terms of protection, Andres and I are not sure whether we understood exactly what is the meaning of this word and how protection impacts on the work of urban refugees. So if you could elaborate a little bit, please.
I think the question is referring to protection in the sense of activities that address the protection needs of a population that might be more vulnerable. So gender issues often come up under protection, child protection, the elderly, people with disabilities, people who might be more vulnerable and require activities that specifically go out of their way to address the protection of these populations. So sometimes these things protection work looks at providing safe spaces for children or for women, for example, and these types of activities.
So, well, in terms of women in the gender balance, I guess I addressed the question. In terms of the elderly population, it depends on what is the situation of the older people, whether they are fit for work, whether they culturally or individually they would like to work or not, and at the same time if there are benefits for the elderly not to work, whether the family can support, whether there is unemployment benefit. Each situation is a situation. In terms of children, definitely the policy is to avoid putting children into the labor market, and this is basically the policy, is that children have to go to school and they should not work unless, of course, minor activities to help the father or the mother or the extended family, but nothing that will impact on their education or even on their physical or mental health. I mean, to carry heavy loads, etc. This is in several hours per day. This is definitely not recommended. Adolescents is a different matter because they are by definition or by international regulations allowed to certain types of work, but not other types. This has to be balanced with education.
Thank you, Edmundo. We'll move now to the next area, and that's one that you mentioned briefly when you were speaking about the Haiti example, and that is the issue of informal economies. And the specific question that came in was, how can those involved in the informal urban economy or those earning daily wages be effectively targeted in a humanitarian context? And so I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about informal work to address this question.
As you may be aware, there are many cities in developing countries with large amounts of informal workers, and sometimes the majority of the workforce is in the informal sector. In terms of specific policies, they may vary from case to case, but even in a so-called normal situation, which is not a disaster situation, the policies may vary, but by and large, a basic policy in regard to the informal sector is to start by protecting the informal workers rather than discriminating against the informal workers. And at the same time, create conditions for informal workers and for informal enterprises to enter into the mainstream of the economy. This is the ILO policy. It's not only the ILO which thinks like this, but other people may think differently. In situations of crisis, the informal sector may need to be even more supported. If in a city in which you have a large number of poor people and a large number of the poor working in the informal sector, many times because they cannot find formal and paid employment. So in these situations, if there is a crisis, you have even more people resorting to the informal sector. So they do need the easy and the general answer to this is that the informal sector needs to be protected, and may need to be even more supported, not only tolerated, supported. Otherwise, people will literally die. And by support, I mean not only tolerance, but also opportunities for businesses, opportunities for training, investment, and whatever they will need to keep going in the economy.
That's great. Thanks very much. Another area we've got quite a few questions about relates to assessment and monitoring. And so I'll put a few of these questions to you together in hopes that you can talk about this area a bit in more detail. The questions we've got so far are, what key information is required for effective monitoring and analysis for urban labor and livelihoods? Should access or wages be the priority when it comes to labor monitoring? what questions are most effective when assessing urban labor and livelihoods activities? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit to these types of questions.
Very interesting questions. On the question of well, what should be the priority on access to employment on wages? Well, that depends a little bit on the situation. If the question is about a given specific project, the project will have its indicators which include normally both, and this should orient the priority setting a little bit, as also the information gathering. If the question is about the development of livelihoods, more in general terms, like in a given recurring city, then this becomes more complex. We should be talking about the entire decent work agenda, not only about these issues in ideal terms. Where of course the first step to this would be to start employment generation, because of course we can't speak about decent employment without employment. So that would be the answer to that question. And then on the what key information is required to effectively monitor labor and livelihoods. Well, it's a little bit on that what I said. There needs to be also information not only on those wages and employment, but also on the situation of enterprises, on the different problems in terms of physical infrastructure and inputs and access to finance, also applicable of course to people for self-employment and that. And on the question on the key effective assessments for urban livelihoods at designing labor-oriented interventions, it depends on what are the existing decent work deficits for a given situation. In the case of disaster relief, one has to start from scratch and focus on the question of how to provide immediate jobs that enable workers and their families to meet basic and very basic needs, which may be complemented by social protection in a big sense, including all the sectors of humanitarian aid, on shelter, health, and also on food, sanitation. And then afterwards, one could ask the question of how to rebuild and build the pillars of decent work on social dialogue and the different social partners, on enterprise training, skills training, etc., etc.
Keeping with the theme of kind of assessment and analysis, there's a question that's come in about mapping. And I wonder if either of you have any experience with using mapping for urban livelihoods and analysis, and whether mapping urban livelihoods can improve the targeting and response analysis that's required in complex urban environments. I know quite a few of the people in the community of practice are quite interested in mapping. I wonder if you could touch on this aspect a little bit.
I know some different tools that have been used, and we have a report of 2013 on which uses mapping tools to assess the different livelihoods situation of IDPs and returnees in host communities in Afghanistan. It's available in the webpage, and also we've been looking into this tool on the emergency market mapping and analysis used by different agencies, including UNHCR, UNDP, and just like DRC.
These are good suggestions.
Yeah.
The EMMA and the ILO 2013.
So I would direct the viewers to those different tools and resources.
Going back to the issue that we kind of touched on before in terms of the host community or the host economy, there's some questions about evidence and impact, and I'll just put these together for you. What evidence exists of the positive and or negative effects of, for example, refugee or IDP labor on a host economy? Is there any evidence about how quickly economic recovery should begin following an urban disaster?
Yeah, well, it's also a very interesting question. Well, the question on quickness of economic recovery, it's a little bit about resilience, the concept of resilience, of how quickly a community recovers. But of course, it's very difficult to assess directly, because there's different types and different magnitudes of disasters. And of course, with a low displacement rate or refugee rates in host communities, the impact will be smaller and so forth. Recently, we've been reading a little bit on this, and there is, in general, there's a good effects on the labor aspects of the host community. And one I read actually this morning was Graybaum 2014 in the case of Uganda, and the report is called "Their Suffering or Burden: How Congolese Refugees Affect Ugandan Population." And there basically you find how the refugees population increased the demand for goods and the general consumption of the host population. But well, there's also cases where it is found that well, in the case of IDPs in Colombia, it was found that they had possibly a negative impact on salaries, because IDPs mainly accessed urban areas, but through informal jobs, not the formal, not formal jobs. So there was an increase in competition for these informal jobs, which for low-skilled workers meant that their wages went down. However, their employment situation was less altered. So we need to think about the different legal aspects to this. And of course, neither of these studies show the complete truth. It's more context specific, and also depending on that regulation, it can be have a more positive or more negative impact. But definitely, it's an issue which should that should further be studied.
While we're touching on the topic of the economy, a question's come in that's a bit related about private sector engagement. And so I'll put this one to you next. How do we ensure sustained engagement of the private sector in labor and employment in the recovery stage and beyond urban disasters?
Yeah, the participation of the private sector, there are different angles. And of course, again, each case is a bit different, because it depends on whether the place has been partially affected by a crisis, whether there is the local private sector is still in place and can, let's say, regrow itself a bit easier, or whether the local private sector has been totally devastated and needs to be reconstructed from scratch. But anyway, the general point is that the private businesses may need to be supported depending on the the impact and the dimension of the crisis. When we talk about long-term employment in a market-driven economy, of course we are talking about a expanding private sector, so there may need to be investment. So the private sector needs to be supported. At the same time, the ILO and other agencies, they advocate the policy of to the extent possible use of labor-intensive techniques. So the more you use labor-intensive techniques, of course, the more you spread opportunities of employment. So it is also important to raise the awareness of private entrepreneurs about using such techniques so that they can expand the opportunities of employment. And from the other side, normally when we talk about the private, I mean, I've been talking about the private sector as a recipient of support, and normally humanitarian assistance comes from NGOs, comes from government agencies and international agencies. Perhaps the private sector can also be a donor, and not only the recipient. I mean, the local private sector, of course, has to be a recipient, but if there are private enterprises which they feel that they have enough conditions to also come on board to support a given city or town under a crisis situation or recovering from a crisis, this is very important as well, of course. And this investment may be either a commercial investment, if a private company feels that there is opportunity for this in the short or the long term, or a CSR investment, corporate social responsibility, which is very much discussed nowadays, and definitely it should have a connection with a humanitarian response.
The next question area that I'll bring up deals with self-directed coping mechanisms. And this question specifically is, does ILO have any experience building on the self-directed coping mechanisms of affected people in the aftermath of disaster?
As Nuno was saying, this is an area in which the ILO doesn't work too much on self-help, but definitely we should build up on the capabilities of the humanitarian agencies and the humanitarian actions to work more on this.
A question's just come in that I'll pose at this time. Do you think that there are certain types of labor activities that are appropriate in conflict situations specifically, and how would you suppose integrating these with local economies in conflict situations specifically? Are there certain types of labor activities more appropriate for these types of settings?
Yeah, well, I guess that question is made as opposed to natural disaster crisis, in which, like for example of Haiti, we've seen about the importance of the construction sector and what's that opportunity. There are many urban sectors and that of course have an important role, and I wouldn't say that there is one specific for conflict crisis. We should see at the specific context of the city and which sectors are important. Maybe one of the most important, and it's a recurring issue, is about food security and the importance of that even in rapidly changing conflict situations. So that there could be there are sectors related to that which would be in that solution maybe.
As we wrap up with the last maybe 3 or 4 questions, I have a two-part question for you next, and the first part is a bit more theoretical, which I'll pose first, and then maybe add a related practical question that's also come in, and that's to do with this sustainable livelihoods framework that's used, I guess, in the development sector and also the humanitarian world. What do you think of this framework in terms of the urban context? Does this framework or other labor or livelihoods frameworks that we use require adaptation for the urban context?
Yes, the short or perhaps also the long answer is yes. One person that I know that did a lot of work on urban sustainable livelihoods framework is a British academic called Carol Rakodi, but there has been many others also working on this. The Sustainable Livelihoods Framework has been designed initially for rural areas, and it has been used in urban areas, and it requires adaptations. For instance, I mentioned briefly in the beginning of my presentation that the Sustainable Livelihoods includes access to different types of assets or capitals, like physical capitals, financial capitals, social capitals. The urban and the rural economies are very different in many places. The skills, which are the human assets, needs are different in rural and urban areas, depending on the sectors of the economy. Social capital is usually much stronger in rural areas, and therefore it requires much more support in urban areas than in rural areas. And the physical assets, they also vary a lot, so it does need adaptation.
The related practical question deals with sustainability of employment and local economies. And the question is this one: can you suggest any specific examples of work that humanitarians should actively be involved in helping people find that will promote the sustainability of employment and local economies?
It's a very general question. Of course, if I'm understanding it, it's on the different sectors that involve. Historically, well, for a lot of time and still now, humanitarians focus on very specific sectors, on mainly for men it's construction, and for women many times it's tailoring and textiles. Maybe there's opportunities for precisely urban sectors that have a lot more capabilities, but of course then we need a livelihoods assessment to see which ones have greater opportunities, and then match the skills needs with the also the desires, the preferences of the people, because of course taken by a motivated student that wants to work in such sectors, it's a lot more useful than one that can be potentially very good for them in achieving employment, but if they're not really motivated to study this, it won't be useful.
I think we'll pose our final question now, as we're nearing the end of our hour and a half together. The final question, it goes back to an issue we touched on right at the beginning, and that also came up during your presentation, that I think is quite a relevant one, given a lot of the context at the moment in the world. And this question has to do with, again, the tension between IDP and refugee populations and host societies, and it comes from a slightly different angle. How can we prepare host societies for the incoming impact of refugees and IDPs in order to then reduce social tension and better integrate communities? So what can we do now to prepare host societies who are likely to be receiving refugees and IDPs to reduce this social tension in advance?
This is a little bit beyond the scope of the ILO, but of course it also relates because the ILO deals a lot with migrants, and cities and towns, as we know, many of them includes a large population of migrants, and there are many tensions on the legal framework. The ILO promotes the acceptance of migrants and the absorption of migrants into the mainstream economy. On the one hand, this helps, obviously it will help the migrants because they will find more opportunities if they have legal access to the economy, rather than that if they have to accept only informal or even illegal activities. At the same time, if they are working in officially accepted jobs, it's a little bit more difficult for people to complain against them as opposed to migrants who are working in illegal activities, if you know what I mean. So this, I think it's an important step for recognition. At the same time, it will require a lot of efforts of awareness raising from the government, also from humanitarian organizations, to help the host community to understand the problems of the people who come to the cities and towns, that these people are not there for fun, that they decided to migrate because of huge crisis and intense acute poverty where they come from, and we are all human beings. We need to help each other, and in the long run the cities will benefit from migrants. We have many wonderful examples of cities and towns built and run mainly by migrant populations.
That's great, and I think an uplifting note to end on. Thank you again to both of you, Edmundo and Andreas. This has been a really fascinating session, and I can tell by the number of questions that are still coming in that people are really interested in this topic and have found this session really valuable. So thank you both so much, as well as a big thank you to everyone who stayed with us for the hour and a half and asked questions or shared their own experiences. Any questions which weren't addressed in the webinar we'll be putting into the Urban Response Community of Practice. You're also welcome to contact us. You'll see a few different options on your screen right now if you have any ideas for future webinars. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers from the ILO, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Have a great day. Bye.